Hey guys, as we wind down tonight, we find ourselves in a narrow chamber where the air smells faintly of candle wax, old leather, and the restless hush of turning pages. You're standing in a scriptorium, a place where monks with ink-stained fingers copied the words that would outlast them by centuries. Every breath you take is a little draught of history, cool and dry, like the parchment laid flat on a wooden desk that looks ready to collapse under the weight of accumulated thoughts. You might think you're safe here, wrapped in the soft glow of lantern light, but you might not survive this one, because the quiet influence of these books is far stranger and heavier than you expect. Maybe you imagined medieval texts as delicate treasures locked away behind iron gates, touched only by gloved hands and polite curiosity. No. The truth is, some of them were handled like kitchen utensils passed from one grubby palm to another, annotated in margins with complaints about the weather or the price of fish. Others were revered so much they were chained to desks, like sullen dogs who might run away. You'll discover tonight that the line between sacred knowledge and common annoyance was about as thin as a spiderweb, easy to break, impossible to ignore. So, before you settle in, feel free to give the video a like and hit subscribe if you're truly enjoying the journey. You can also leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always a small wonder to see people tuning in from so many corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan, for that gentle hum in the background, and together, let's ease into tonight's story. You pick up a book the size of a small paving stone. It's heavier than you expected, the cover creaking like a tired knee when you open it. The parchment inside feels as though it's been dipped in chalk and memories. Your first instinct is to imagine that this manuscript, so imposing and dignified, has always commanded respect. But it didn't start that way. When it was first made, someone probably grumbled about the smell of the ink, which carried the pungent sharpness of boiled oak galls and something that reminded you vaguely of a burnt cabbage. You might assume that these books were rare and precious from the moment of their creation, but in truth, they often lingered unnoticed on shelves, quietly gathering layers of dust that stuck to the vellum like a second skin. You're standing in the corner of a cramped monastery library, shifting from foot to foot, because there's no place to sit that isn't already occupied by a pile of theological treatises bound in cracked leather. The air is stale, perfumed with the sour-sweet tang of mildew. You thought it would be a serene place, but no, the scriptorium is always alive with small frustrations. A scribe might spend 6 hours drawing a single illuminated initial, only to sneeze and smear the ink across a week's labour. The candles spit little sparks of tallow that threaten to scorch the margins, and no one ever talks about how cold it is. You expect a library to be warm, somehow cosy, protective. But the stones suck away your body heat until you feel like you're being politely refrigerated. You run your finger along the edge of a page and feel a ridge where a monk once pressed too hard with his stylus. Maybe he was irritated that morning, cursing the chill and the uncooperative quill. Or maybe he simply didn't care that his effort would end up outliving him by centuries. You imagine he never suspected that you'd be here, centuries later, wondering if the dark smudge beside the text was a careless blot or an intentional correction. There's something almost deceitful about these old books. From a distance, they look orderly, imposing, as though they're repositories of eternal truth. But up close, they reveal their imperfections like the thin cracks in the parchment that resemble the lines spreading across your own knuckles. You expect each volume to deliver a profound revelation the moment you open it. Instead, you find that most pages are crammed with predictable sermons, the occasional shopping list in the margins, and small illustrations of saints who look bored to tears. You set the book down gently, as though it might bite. And in a way, it already has, because now you can't stop thinking about all the hands that held it before yours. Hands that were calloused from labour, stained with ink, or trembling with cold. You thought this would be a quiet encounter with history, but you realize that the past never stays politely on the page. It creeps into your imagination, scratches at the walls of your certainty, and leaves you with questions that have no intention of answering themselves. You try to imagine the first time a monk unrolled a fresh sheet of parchment, its pale surface as smooth as a frozen pond. Maybe he paused, quill poised, believing that this time, the words would flow like an obedient river, precise and elegant. They never did. You assume scribes spend their days in quiet contemplation, crafting wisdom with practiced serenity, but in reality, their work was a daily gauntlet of small humiliations. Ink that refused to dry, nibs that splintered at the worst moment, cramped fingers aching from hours spent bent over cramped wooden desks. Each letter was a battle between intention and the stubborn materials of their trade, and always there was the unshakable cold. The stone walls sucked every flicker of warmth into their pores, leaving the air as thin and brittle as old bone. You shift your weight and realize you're not the first to do so beneath your feet. The floorboards are warped from generations of pacing, restless movement that no amount of reverence could still. You expect the library to feel eternal, but it reveals its mortality everywhere you look. A patch where damp has chewed through the plaster, a crack in the lintel like a vein of quiet despair. You thought the words themselves might glow with importance, but as you squint at the cramped script, you find that even grand proclamations about kingdoms and saints are laced with petty details, complaints about ink costs, little curses against vermin, cryptic notes about whose turn it was to stir the soup. You run your finger along a line and wonder if the scribe wrote it on an empty stomach. You can almost hear his sigh, the tired resignation of someone who knows tomorrow's page will look much the same. You catch the faint scent of old tallow drifting up from the margin, reminding you that this book spent more nights beside an unsteady candle than you've spent in any one place. Your eyes water as you blink, and for a moment you imagine the text shifting under your gaze, as if it wants to slip back into the past and escape your scrutiny. You expect clarity, but the longer you stare, the more the words blur, until they seem to dissolve into a pale fog of intentions never quite fulfilled. Some part of you hoped that touching these pages would feel momentous, that your fingers would tremble with the weight of inherited knowledge. Instead, it feels a little like holding a stale loaf of bread, unexpectedly heavy, a bit crumbly, and inclined to leave traces all over your hands. You set it down carefully, though, because you know that even imperfect things can outlast the best intentions. The book closes with a reluctant sigh, as if it resents being disturbed after so many years of dignified neglect. You look around the scriptorium, half expecting applause for your curiosity, but no one else is there to witness it. The silence settles back in, a soft layer of indifference that feels both comforting and vaguely reproachful. You remind yourself that most people never noticed these books at all, until one day, the quiet influence they carried slipped, almost by accident, into everything. You lift another volume from the shelf, and it's so large you wonder if the scribe who made it was quietly competing with every other monk in the monastery. The cover is darkened in patches, as though it spent a few centuries absorbing the fingerprints of countless hesitant readers. You expect it to creak open with theatrical gravity, but it resists you, its binding stiff as an old man's knees. When it finally yields, a faint puff of dust rises, carrying with it the sharp, earthy scent of parchment and the distant whiff of damp straw. You feel momentarily like you've disturbed something that would rather be left to its slumber, but you press on, because that's what curiosity does. It insists on prying open the lids of things that were perfectly content to stay closed. As your eyes travel across the page, you notice the text has been corrected so many times that it looks like a battlefield. Words scraped out with a blade, new letters crammed into margins, entire lines crossed with a series of agitated slashes that resemble the tracks of a chicken wearing tiny boots. You'd assume these books were paragons of precision, but here you are, faced with evidence that scribes were as fallible as anyone. You can almost hear the resigned muttering, the gritted teeth, the internal vow never to copy this particular treatise again. You trace a line of faded red ink and wonder if it was added on a day when the scribe's hands were so cold they trembled. You imagine him leaning over the page in the dim light, squinting as his breath fogged in front of him. Perhaps he dreamed, absurdly, that this work would bring him closer to divinity, but instead it only brought him closer to arthritis. You think of your own complaints, your back aching from sitting too long, your eyes straining after an hour, and realize you're not so different. The only real change is that you don't have to grind your own ink out of iron salts and vinegar that smells like disappointment. In the margins, you find a little drawing of a man holding a stick, chasing what appears to be a very fat goose. It feels out of place beside the solemn text, but that's the way with old books. They slip a moment of levity between paragraphs about sin and redemption. You expect gravity, and instead you find a doodle that looks suspiciously like the scribe mocking his own predicament. Maybe he was hungry. Maybe he was bored. Maybe he just wanted to prove that no work, no matter how sacred, is immune to a little absurdity. You close the book and feel its weight settle in your arms, solid and unrepentant. It doesn't care whether you appreciate it or not. It will outlast you regardless, waiting for the next pair of hands to pry it open and wonder why knowledge always seems to wear the same slightly exasperated face. You set it back on the shelf with a soft thump that sounds a little like resignation. You thought you came here to learn. You didn't realize you'd leave with a deeper respect for the quiet messiness that threads through every so-called monument to human achievement. You stand back and take in the shelves, each one sagging slightly under the weight of centuries, as if the wood itself is tired of carrying so many opinions bound in calfskin. You imagine that to the monks who first placed these books here, each volume was a small victory over ignorance, a fragile outpost of clarity in a world that often felt like a badly organized barn. But you suspect they also viewed them as obligations, things that had to be maintained, dusted, copied, argued over. You expect reverence to be the only emotion they inspired, but the truth is probably closer to a grudging respect mixed with the same weary irritation you feel when you notice the pile of unread papers on your own table. You ease another book from the shelf, surprised by how its spine surrenders with a soft crack, like a joint finally stretching after years of disuse. The cover is a mottled brown, the colour of stale gravy, with corners that look chewed, although whether by mice or monks is anyone's guess. You expect the contents to be luminous, something that will enlighten you instantly. Instead, you discover a laborious catalogue of rents owed to the monastery, lists of tenants with names that repeat so often you suspect the entire village was populated by 3 families who couldn't be bothered to invent new surnames. You turn the pages, feeling the parchment resist your fingers with a texture halfway between soft leather and old onion skin. Each line is ruled in red ink so wobbly it seems to have been drawn by a man who was either drunk or simply gave up caring somewhere around the 3rd folio. You thought these records would be impartial, but scattered among the rent tallies are small notes, in the margins tiny complaints about a tenant's bad attitude or a sullen remark about an unpaid debt. You're reminded uncomfortably that bureaucracy is older than you ever wanted to believe, and that even the most pious scribe was still, in the end, just a person with opinions and grievances that seeped through the cracks of their work. As you reach the middle of the book, a loose scrap of parchment slips out and flutters to the floor. You pick it up, expecting some forgotten prayer or a profound fragment of wisdom. What you find is a shopping list, carefully itemized in the same earnest hand that recorded the spiritual debts of the community. There it is, cheese, onions, candles, and a line that simply reads, "Soap if any left," which feels like the most honest piece of history you've ever encountered. You realize that your expectation of solemnity has been toppled by the mundane. You place the scrap back inside the book and close the cover, feeling a reluctant affection for this volume that tried so hard to be important but couldn't quite escape the gravitational pull of everyday life. It sits in your hands, heavy and unpretentious, a reminder that knowledge isn't always grand. Sometimes it's just a record of debts, petty frustrations, and the occasional forgotten bar of soap. You set it back, the shelf creaking under the combined burden of memory and mildew, and step away, knowing you'll never look at these quiet pages the same way again. You drift down the aisle, feeling the hush grow thicker, as though each row of books is conspiring to muffle your thoughts. You rest your hand against a volume so massive it seems to have its own gravitational field, and for a moment you consider not opening it. The cover looks like it was once a fine leather, maybe even embossed, but now it resembles the cracked skin of an old apple left too long on a winter windowsill. You expect something solemn inside, perhaps a chronicle of kings and saints, but when you lift the front board with careful fingers, you are greeted by a sprawling table of weights and measures, recorded in a hand that seems almost apologetic for its own existence. You pause, breathing in the musty scent that unfurls from the parchment like a damp blanket. It is the smell of every neglected corner you've ever known, and it makes you feel unexpectedly tender toward this cumbersome record. You would think, standing here in the dim light, that such a ledger would be dead, a fossilized remnant of transactions no one remembers. But the truth is, it feels disconcertingly alive. Every scribbled correction, every cramped notation in the margins, every crossed out line and inserted clause, they all testify to someone's effort to keep the world in order, even if that order was about as stable as a lopsided stool. You slide your thumb along a column of numbers and wonder about the scribe, who spent weeks tallying bushels of grain that probably went missing before the ink dried. You imagine him hunched over his desk, the quill trembling between cold fingers, muttering curses at the farmers who could never agree on what they owed. You think he must have believed he was creating something permanent, but all you see is a record of arguments preserved like flies in amber. You expect clarity, but each line is another layer of confusion, names repeated, amounts corrected, debts erased, and reappearing a page later. Halfway through, you find a page that has been patched with a scrap of darker parchment, glued in place with some substance that smells faintly of vinegar and defeat. You expect this patch to conceal something momentous, a scandal perhaps, or a secret tax, but when you lift the edge just enough to peek underneath, all you find is a doodle of a fish with an oddly human face. It stares back at you, unimpressed, as though it knows you were expecting revelation and wants you to feel ashamed of your curiosity. You let the page fall back into place and close the ledger with a decisive thump that echoes in the quiet room. For a moment you feel almost embarrassed by your hope that a book of measurements would contain a hidden truth. But then you realize that maybe this is the hidden truth, that most of what endures isn't great declarations or shining ideals, but the daily attempts to record what was owed, what was grown, what was broken, and what was briefly believed to matter. You set the book back on its shelf, and the dust rises in a small, resigned cloud. You expected importance, but you have found something stranger, and perhaps more honest, a record of ordinary life pretending it was grand. You take a slow step backward and survey the room, the rows of shelves looming like patient sentinels, each one gently accusing you of underestimating them. You imagine that if these books could speak, they'd have a tone not of triumph, but of tired amusement, as though they've seen generations of eager scholars come striding in, brimming with grand expectations, only to leave muttering about the dust, the confusion, and the disappointment that knowledge is rarely tidy. You place your hand on another volume, this one smaller, wrapped in a cracked binding that feels slick beneath your fingers, like an old waxed tablecloth no one ever bothered to clean properly. You expect it to be a collection of sermons or a saint's life, but when you open it, the pages are covered in lists of household goods. There are inventories of spoons, broken ladles, chipped pitchers, and somewhere near the bottom of one page, a note that simply reads, "One chicken, presumed stolen." You try not to laugh, but you can't help it. You thought you'd come here to discover hidden wisdom, yet you keep stumbling over someone else's accounting problems. It feels as if the universe is gently reminding you that most of history isn't made up of decisive battles or soaring proclamations, but the mundane effort of keeping track of objects that wander off when no one's looking. You trace the scribe's careful lines, noticing how the ink grows thin toward the end of each page. Maybe the scribe was running out, or maybe he just couldn't be bothered to refill the pot again. You expect a solemn hand to have written these records, but the writing wavers and tilts in a way that suggests the author was either very tired or mildly drunk, and possibly both. You can almost hear him sighing, the sound echoing through the centuries as if to say, yes, it mattered enough to write down, but not enough to do neatly. In the margin, a small drawing of a jug sits beside a string of notes about its repair. The jug has a crooked handle and what looks suspiciously like a face drawn on its belly, 2 dots and a curved line, a quietly defiant little smile. You expect solemnity, but the jug seems determined to remind you that even in the middle of meticulous record-keeping, there was room for a moment of absurdity. You close the book and feel the weight of it settle into your palms like an old cat deciding you're acceptable company. For a long moment you stand there, considering the quiet power of these pages. They don't shout their importance. They don't demand awe. Instead, they whisper that even the most ordinary record is a kind of testament. A ledger of spoons and a note about a missing chicken might seem trivial, but it's the small things that outlast the grand gestures, the unglamorous traces of lives once lived and then forgotten. You place the book carefully back on the shelf, feeling as if you've just been let in on a secret you didn't know you needed. It isn't what you expected, but maybe that's the point. You drift to the far end of the scriptorium, where the shelves narrow into a cramped alcove that smells like damp wool and the peculiar sweetness of old glue. The air is colder here, the stones pressing in on all sides until you feel as though the room itself wants to remind you that learning has never been especially comfortable. You pick up a thin book that looks almost embarrassed to be here, its cover patched with mismatched scraps of leather sewn together like a badly planned quilt. You expect it to be unremarkable, some dull catalogue no one ever bothered to read, but curiosity keeps tugging at you, that small, insistent impulse to see whether something forgotten might still have teeth. When you ease it open, the first page greets you with a flourish of ink that tries very hard to look confident, though you suspect the scribe was practicing his script for the first time. The letters loop and sprawl, each line slanting downward, as if weighed down by invisible disappointment. You thought the writing would grow more polished as you turned the pages, but it never does. Instead, every folio is a testament to a steady decline in ambition, as though the scribe began with optimism and ended in the weary acceptance that legibility was optional. You find yourself smiling, despite the cold seeping through the soles of your shoes. The text itself is an odd mixture, part herbal remedies, part household advice, part stern warnings about what happens when you fail to pay your debts. One recipe calls for boiling nettles with vinegar to cure melancholy of the spleen, which sounds about as effective as wrapping yourself in a damp cloth and hoping for the best. You expect clarity, but the instructions read like a list of dares scribbled by someone who had never once tested them. Your fingers brush over a marginal note written in a smaller, more desperate hand. Do not trust this. Tried twice. You imagine the anonymous reader, probably scowling into the gloom of this same alcove, their hopes for an easy cure dashed by the realization that boiling weeds rarely solves anything. You think you came here to learn, but mostly you're collecting small, resigned confessions left by strangers who also wanted life to be simpler. A few pages later, you stumble across a line that seems more personal. Brother Tom refuses to return my shears. It sits there in the margin like an accusation that outlasted every sermon and every recipe in the book. You expect the grand topics of faith and knowledge to be the heart of every medieval text, but here you find the petty quarrels and everyday irritations that never stopped mattering. You close the book and feel its quiet weight in your hands. It is smaller than the others, less ambitious, almost shy, but you suspect it holds a truer record of the world than all the pompous chronicles stacked around it. You slide it back into its place, feeling a peculiar gratitude that someone, hundreds of years ago, cared enough to record both the hopeful remedies and the unremarkable complaints. You expected wisdom, but you leave the alcove warmed by the reminder that history is built just as much from small grievances as it is from great ideas. You move toward a low shelf near the window, where a row of volumes leans against one another like tired companions who have long since given up pretending they're not exhausted. The sunlight filters in through a gap in the shutters, casting a pale rectangle across the covers and catching the dust motes as they drift lazily in the cold air. You crouch to pull out a narrow ledger that seems to have been wedged in place for at least a century. The binding yields with a reluctant groan that sounds almost offended by your curiosity. You expect the usual lists of tithes and rents, but as you ease the cover back, you find something different, pages filled with annotations in several hands, each more exasperated than the last. The first entries are simple enough, neat rows of inventories recording every sack of barley and wedge of cheese. But gradually the handwriting changes, becoming slanted and cramped, as if the scribes were trying to save space or energy, or perhaps both. You thought the purpose of record keeping was clarity, but here the notes pile up like fallen leaves, each one half burying the last. You trace a line with your fingertip, deciphering an argument about a missing cauldron that seems to have spanned 3 generations. One scribe accused another of losing it. The next insisted it had been borrowed. The last simply scrawled, "Gone, no matter." as though finally surrendering to the futility of the dispute. It strikes you that these books were never neutral objects. They were battlegrounds, paper landscapes where grudges and obligations skirmished quietly for centuries. You think you'd feel out of place in such a scene, but instead you feel a strange kinship with the long-vanished scribes who documented their frustrations alongside their ledgers. You expect a ledger to be impersonal, but this one reads like a diary written by people who weren't allowed to admit how tired they were. A few pages deeper, you stumble onto a curious list titled Items Most Often Misplaced. You expect it to be dull more cauldrons, maybe a shovel, but it begins with the better lamp, followed by Brother Martin's patience, and finally, any notion of fairness. You don't mean to laugh, but the sound escapes you anyway, bouncing off the stone walls and making you feel briefly alive in the same way a sudden cough reminds you that you haven't turned into dust quite yet. You turn to the last page and find one final entry, a short sentence in a faded hand that simply reads, "It was never about the lamp." You stare at it longer than you mean to, wondering what argument had provoked such a cryptic remark, and whether anyone else ever noticed it before the ledger was tucked back on the shelf to wait out the centuries. You close the cover gently, feeling the corners press into your palms with the steady insistence of something determined to be remembered. You slide it back into its narrow gap and watch the other books settle against it, returning to their quiet solidarity. You expected to feel like an intruder in this place, but instead, you feel as though you've been quietly invited to witness a truth too small for monuments and too human to be erased. You shift your weight to ease the ache in your knees and look down the length of the scriptorium, where another book rests on a crooked stand that appears to have been fashioned by someone who was either very creative or very resigned. The stand leans at an angle that suggests it might collapse if you so much as breathe on it too hard, but you approach anyway, because the whole room has started to feel like an invitation you can't politely refuse. You brace the stand with one hand and open the volume, expecting a treatise on theology or some Darwin enumeration of moral failings. But what greets you is a collection of letters, thin, crackling pages filled with complaints that somehow survived the centuries. You read the first line, penned in a neat, ambitious script to Brother Ulrich, whose promises are worth less than the candle stubs he hoards. You blink, unsure whether to laugh or admire the audacity. You thought medieval correspondence would be dignified, maybe even poetic, but these letters are mostly about petty debts, late deliveries, and small betrayals that feel as familiar as any modern quarrel. One writer insists that he returned a borrowed cloak in better condition than he received it. Another accuses the recipient of losing a delivery of dried fish, and then having the gall to pretend it never arrived. You expect formality, but what you find is exasperation rendered in ink so dark it looks almost fresh. A faint scent of old wax drifts from the page, as if the seal had only recently been broken. You imagine the scribe scribbling furiously, muttering under his breath, while the rest of the monastery pretended not to notice. The lines slope downward, growing steadily smaller, as though the writer was running out of space, patience, or both. Each letter ends with the same weary sign-off. May God soften your heart, which feels less like a blessing and more like a polite way to say, I am done with you. A few pages deeper, you come across a scrap of parchment wedged between letters. You expect it to be another complaint, but instead it's a list of candle supplies, tallow, wicks, scraps of linen scrawled in a different hand. You wonder if the candle shortage was the real cause of all this resentment. You think you've stumbled onto some private feud disguised as official record keeping, and the realization makes you feel oddly at home. It turns out that no century has ever been immune to the small humiliations of unreturned favors. You close the volume carefully, feeling the weight of all those grievances settling like silt in your thoughts. The stand gives a little wobble as you ease the book back into place, as though it, too, is tired of carrying so many disappointments. You expected evidence of higher purpose visions, revelations, divine guidance. Instead, you found a chronicle of inconveniences, recorded with the same solemn care as any holy text. You step back, letting the shelf reclaim its burden, and you realize that this is the quiet influence you never noticed until now, The persistent truth that even in places dedicated to eternity, people spend their days fretting over things as small and stubborn as missing cloaks and poorly rendered promises. You pause in the quiet, the cold stone pressing against your back, as if to remind you that these shelves have endured longer than most of the people who ever wandered through this room. A faint draft sighs over your cheek, carrying the smell of old paper, and something more elusive, a trace of beeswax polish perhaps, or the ghost of 1,000 extinguished candles. You look at the last book you haven't dared to touch yet, a squat little volume wedged so tightly between its neighbours that it seems determined to remain hidden. You brace your palm against the shelf and tug it free, expecting some dull account of monastic expenses. But the cover is embossed with a faint pattern of vines, and when you open it, you discover that it isn't an account book at all. Instead, the first page is a calendar, carefully inked in blue and red, each day marked with a notation that seems almost playful. You squint, reading the tiny script that describes everything from feast days to the predicted weather, and what you suspect are personal reminders disguised as official entries. One note, written in an unusually elaborate hand, declares, "Remember to forgive Brother Thomas," followed immediately by, "and to collect the debts he owes." You expect a dry schedule of religious observances, but the entries read like a blend of grudges and small hopes, pressed together under the pretext of spiritual duty. As you turn the pages, you find a series of observations about the seasons: when the swallows returned, when the river flooded, when the wrist frost turned the garden into a brittle carpet of silver. You think it will be dull, a farmer's almanac in clerical dress, but the descriptions are so precise that they feel almost like small poems smuggled into the ledger. One line describes a winter dawn as the hour when light arrives apologetically, and you can't help but wonder which scribe paused long enough to notice how the cold sun crept over the roof beams. You run your thumb over a column of marginal notes, feeling the indentations where someone pressed their quill too hard. In one corner, a line has been hastily crossed out, but you can still make out the words, "This year we will be better." You expect confident proclamations, but here, in the smallest script, you find doubt and aspiration braided together like a fraying cord. By the last page, you feel as though you've read not an official record, but a diary disguised in clerical ink, and you set the book down with a kind of gentle reluctance. It doesn't matter that you don't know the scribe's name, or whether he ever forgave Brother Thomas. What matters is the realization that this unassuming little volume has been whispering its story through centuries of indifference. You slide it back into its narrow home and watch the spines reeling, as if the books have decided you've seen enough for one visit. You expect to feel satisfied, but instead you're left with an ache you can't quite name, the sense that you've glimpsed a part of the past that is rarely acknowledged, because it isn't grand or violent or heroic. It's just human. And that, you suspect, is the quiet influence that endures long after the ink has faded. You stand before a copy of the Domesday Book, its pages so dense with calculation and accusation that you almost feel them staring back at you. It's strange to think that a book famous for its monumental authority began as a collection of anxious scribbles and rushed interviews, stitched together by clerks who probably wished more than anything for a shorter list of manners to measure. You expect it to feel like a relic unreachable, wrapped in the gravity of 1,000 Solomon historians, but as your eyes scan the columns of figures and terse notations, you begin to see it less as an achievement and more as an act of desperate bookkeeping on an unimaginable scale. You ease open the heavy cover and feel the parchment tug against your fingertips, stiff as old sailcloth. The first lines are a quiet litany of villages and the men who held them, a roll call of lives reduced to acres, oxen, and tax obligations. You'd think it would be dull, the literary equivalent of watching dust settle, but something about its relentless detail makes your chest tighten. You imagine the surveyors trudging across sodden fields, quills tucked behind their ears, trying to look official while local reeves rolled their eyes. You expect an air of authority to rise from the page, but all you feel is the echo of exhaustion, a weariness so total that it might have stained the ink itself. You trace a line that records the livestock owed by a small tenant in Yorkshire, noting that he possessed exactly 3 pigs and the obligation to deliver 1 piglet every Michaelmas. You think for a moment how it must have felt to know that even the smallest squealing animal could be tallied against your name. an unerasable proof of your existence that was also a reminder of your obligations. You expect the Domesday Book to feel impartial, but it has the air of a giant ledger that never once pretended to care about fairness. Farther down the page, the script shifts abruptly from precise to hurried, as though the scribe suddenly realized he had 20 more entries to finish before dusk. The letters lean forward, crowding each other, as if trying to escape the parchment altogether. You almost laugh at the thought that something so revered was compiled in a rush of cold hands and fading light. You'd imagined it being written in perfect silence, a solemn monk recording each fact with the gravitas of divine judgment, but you suspect there were far more curses muttered under tired breath than any official chronicle would admit. You set the book down and flex your fingers, which have gone stiff just from holding it open. It is a monumental thing, heavier than it looks, and graced with the peculiar authority of an object that can still compel respect even after centuries. Yet, as you watch the pages settle back into place, you feel a reluctant affection for a ledger so sprawling, so petty, and so determined to measure every corner of a kingdom that it feels less like history and more like an epic argument disguised as record-keeping. You expect it to impress you, but instead, it has simply made you feel more human. You lean forward and run your palm across the page, feeling each indentation as though it might transmit a little of its purpose into your skin. The ink is faded in places, the letters worn thin by the passage of hands more numerous than you can imagine. You expect that holding the Domesday Book would feel like communing with authority, but the more you stare, the more it seems to resemble the ledger of a very determined tax collector who never once believed in mercy. Your eyes trace the neat columns recording who held each parcel of land before the Norman conquest and who held it after, and you can almost taste the resentment hidden between the lines. You read an entry describing a village reduced in value since the king's men last came through. The scribe has noted it in the margin with a phrase that feels too blunt to be official, much diminished. You wonder if that was the scribe's attempt at understatement, because you can picture the place a cluster of timber houses, the wind moaning through gaps in the walls, the fields lying fallow because no one dared plant anything when the armies came. You expect a record of victory, but here, the story reads more like a long list of losses politely arranged in alphabetical order. As you turn to another folio, the parchment creaks under your hand, and the sound reminds you of old floorboards settling after a house has been abandoned. You try to imagine the clerks who compiled all this, wandering from manor to manor with their wax tablets, scribbling down each claim while the villagers glowered at them from doorways. You suspect that for every number recorded here, there were 10 more left unspoken, tucked away behind tight mouths and folded arms. You expect the Domesday Book to be all-seeing, but it's only as complete as the people were willing to allow. Farther down the column, you notice that a scribe has drawn a small cross beside the name of a tenant who failed to appear when summoned. The cross is almost delicate, a tiny mark of judgment that outlasted every excuse the man might have offered. You wonder if he ever knew his absence had been memorialized in this way, or if he simply vanished into the fog of other unfinished accounts. You expect certainty from such a famous document, but it's filled with these silent question marks, reminders that even the most exhaustive records were stitched together with guesswork and omissions. You close your eyes for a moment and try to picture the finished book being carried into the king's hall, its weight cradled like a newborn. You imagine the hush as it was laid open, the courtiers leaning forward to glimpse the shape of a kingdom rendered in ink. You expect that moment to feel triumphant, but when you open your eyes again, all you see is a collection of lives measured in acres and debts. You ease the cover shut, the boards meeting with a tired finality, and you realize that this book's greatest power is not that it recorded everything perfectly, but that it proved how little perfection mattered when survival was the real business at hand. You slide your fingers across another page and notice how the ink has bled into the parchment over the centuries, the letters softened until they look like something left out in the rain. You expect this to be a simple list: names, measurements, obligations, but as you follow each line, you begin to feel the unspoken tension behind it. This was never just a survey. It was a reckoning, a way to remind every landholder, free or bound, that nothing escaped the gaze of the crown. Even now, You sense the quiet dread that must have settled in each household as the king's clerks approached, their wax tablets ready to trap every acre and every animal in the unrelenting web of obligation. You read an entry noting that a small manor was waste, a phrase that feels both dismissive and enormous. You imagine the villagers returning after years of war to find their fields scorched, their timber halls caved in, their orchards stripped down to raw branches. You expect the scribe to offer some explanation, but all you find is that stark, two-word judgment was waste. It's as if the clerks believed their job was not to describe the ruin but to measure it, to distill 1,000 days of hunger into a single curt phrase. The deeper you read, the more you realize how much of this book is shaped by absence fields left unplowed, men unaccounted for, debts unpaid. You expect completeness, but the record is full of holes that feel deliberate, as though the scribes knew some truths were best left unwritten. You find an entry about a certain meadow said to yield 3 wagon loads of hay if the season is merciful. The word "if" catches in your mind, small and apologetic, a single syllable that quietly admits that even a book this vast could not pretend the future was certain. You pause, pressing your thumb into the thick margin, and try to imagine how it must have felt to hear your name spoken by a man with ink-stained fingers, your livelihood reduced to lines on a wax tablet. You expect indignation, but instead you feel a strange sympathy for both sides. The clerks who trudged from manor to manor, knowing each tally might feed a treasury or spark a resentment they'd never see resolved, and the villagers who stared back, wondering how many generations would be bound by what was written that day. Toward the bottom of the page, you find a correction someone has struck through a figure and written another beside it in a thinner, more hesitant hand. You expect this to be some clerical error, but perhaps it was something simpler, a reeve who insisted the old number was wrong, or a tenant who argued a little too convincingly. You realize that even the most authoritative records are a negotiation, a conversation that never really ends, only pauses long enough for someone to scratch another number in the margin. You close the book carefully, feeling its dense weight settle against your palm, like a reminder that you've been measuring the wrong thing all along. You expected to see the kingdom laid bare, but what you found was a ledger haunted by the fear that nothing could ever be fully counted. You rest your palm on the closed volume, feeling its rough surface warm slowly under your skin, as if the book itself is reluctantly offering up a little of its stored memory. You think about how many hands have pressed these same boards, each touch leaving an invisible trace, some clerk's collused thumb, a lord's impatient palm, perhaps even a frightened tenant's hesitant fingertip. You expect those traces to have been erased by centuries of indifference, but instead they seem to hover just beneath the surface, ready to emerge if you only knew how to look for them. You slide your hand down to the brass clasp, which opens with a faint metallic sigh that sounds almost sympathetic. When you lift the cover again, you find another folio bristling with entries, so dense that the text resembles a block of carved wood rather than lines meant to be read. You run your finger along the first column, where each manor is named with the same flat practicality, no embellishment, no flourish, as though the scribes were determined not to let sentimentality slow them down. You expect to feel detached, but the longer you read, the more you sense the quiet burden behind each tally. There's a line about woodland that could feed 30 swine if the acorns fall as they should, and you pause, struck by the simplicity of that hope. A single phrase carrying so much uncertainty, because you suspect that in some years the acorns never fell at all, and the pigs went thin while their owners tried not to count the days until winter. You expect certainty from this record, but it is laced with reminders that nature never signed any of the king's decrees. Farther down, a scribe has scrawled a note so hurried it leans almost sideways. The measure here is in dispute. You almost laugh, because you know that line could apply to nearly every page. This book was supposed to be the final word on who owned what and who owed what, but the more you study it, the more it feels like a map drawn on water, impressive in ambition, doomed in practice. You think about the clerks pacing cold chambers, scratching their calculations onto wax tablets, hoping the numbers would stay fixed long enough to be worth recording. You expect triumph, but what you find is 1,000 small acts of compromise. A bit farther along, You find the only place where the scribe has underlined a sentence twice. It reads simply, "This land was taken," with no explanation of how or why. You imagine the conversation left unrecorded, someone's voice going hoarse insisting it had been stolen, someone else shrugging, quill poised to move on. You expect clarity. But here again is that familiar silence, the hush that follows when no one wants to write down the truth. You ease the cover closed again, feeling the gentle thud of parchment settling into place. For a moment you think the book has exhaled, relieved to be left alone. You step back, your fingers tingling faintly with the memory of all those unspoken stories, and you realize that you haven't been studying a monument. You've been reading a confession disguised as an inventory. You step away from the lectern, your back twinging in protest, and look around the scriptorium as though you've only just realized how much of it is held together by quiet persistence. The cracked window panes patched with waxed linen, the tables propped up on scraps of wood, the floor that sags just enough to make you wonder if the entire building is plotting a slow collapse. You think about how this book, this Domesday Ledger, was never meant to be poetry. It was a tool, blunt and unembarrassed by its own lack of beauty. And yet, as you turn back to it, you feel something like reverence for the sheer scope of the attempt. You expect to feel detached admiration, but instead you feel the curious ache of recognition. You open to another folio, and this time your eyes catch a long passage that catalogues fisheries along the coast. The script is tidy, almost elegant, as though the scribe felt some hidden pride in recording the rents of so many weirs and fish ponds. You expect bland statistics, but in the middle of the page you find a note about a storm that washed away 3 boats and left the village in hunger and want. The words are small, but they burn against the measured tone of the rest, an uninvited honesty that slipped past whatever supervisor was in charge of maintaining the fiction of order. You imagine the clerk who wrote it, quill pausing as he considered whether to admit what everyone already knew, that the sea never cared about the king's surveys. Farther along, the scribe has doodled a tiny fish in the margin, its eye large and accusing, as if to say, "Go on, measure me again, see if it helps." You almost smile because it feels so familiar, the impulse to add something ridiculous to a page too heavy with seriousness. You expect uniformity, but here you find a small, stubborn refusal to pretend that everything could be neatly weighed. You trace the line of entries, so many names, each reduced to a single obligation. 3 nets owed, 2 barrels of herring delivered each season, fines imposed when the catch fell short. You try to imagine living under that gaze, the knowledge that your livelihood could be boiled down to a handful of numbers in someone else's ledger. You expect to feel pity, but mostly you feel an uneasy kinship, because you know the impulse to count and list is still alive in the modern heart, still hungry to make the untamable world look smaller. When you close the folio, you notice how the binding sighs against your hand, as though it is tired of all the small deceptions it has been asked to hold. You set it carefully back in place, feeling its shape settle between the other volumes like a piece of an ancient puzzle that no one ever finished. You expect satisfaction, but what you carry with you is a sense of unfinished business, a quiet conviction that every record, no matter how precise, is just a fraction of the truth pretending it's the whole. You stand for a moment with your hand resting lightly on the spine of the book, feeling the cold smoothness of the leather warmed only a little by your touch. It strikes you that no matter how carefully you read, you will never know the names of the people whose fields and orchards were measured into these pages. You expect that anonymity would feel comforting, a way to keep the past at a safe distance, but it only leaves you with a peculiar ache, as though you've stumbled into a conversation already halfway finished and no one is willing to repeat themselves. You open to another folio and find a section devoted to livestock tallies. There are lines of neat script noting the number of sheep, pigs, and cattle held in each settlement. You expect it to be dry as old straw, but as you read, you begin to sense the tremor of apprehension behind every figure. One scribe has added a note that a certain herd was reduced by disease, the phrase squeezed into the margin as if he hoped it might escape notice. Another line records that an entire flock vanished, no explanation given. You think of the shepherd who had to stand before the king's clerk and admit that nothing remained but trampled grass and the echo of hoofbeats. You expect triumph in this book's certainty, but again and again, You find the same thin seam of worry threaded between the lines. As you turn the page, a faint puff of air escapes the gap between the sheets, carrying the sour trace of old ink and the earthy ghost of wool. You lean closer, almost believing you can smell the sheep themselves, the rough lanolin clinging to the clerk's fingers as he scratched each line into the record. You imagine him trying to keep his numbers straight, while the farmer beside him shifted from foot to foot, swallowing the urge to explain that no amount of ink could resurrect a vanished flock. You expect these entries to feel abstract, but they leave you thinking about the invisible bruises left behind when ordinary lives are measured in such precise, indifferent terms. Near the bottom of the folio, a figure has been carefully scratched out and replaced. You expect the correction to be a simple clerical error, but you suspect there was a quiet negotiation behind it and, clear, a lowered voice, a grudging compromise. You realize that for all its imposing authority, this book is as much a record of arguments as it is of assets. Every neat column hides the sullen muttering of people who knew exactly what they stood to lose by telling the truth. When you finally ease the folio shut, it does not close politely. The parchment swells against your hand, reluctant to flatten, as though it wants you to understand that no survey can ever stay settled for long. You set the volume back on the shelf, feeling a reluctant gratitude for the way it refuses to let itself be reduced to a tidy relic. You expected to find certainty in these pages, but instead you have learned that every number is just a guess wearing the borrowed clothes of authority. You move to the end of the shelf and find a second volume smaller, bound in cracked leather that looks as though it was chewed by a dog with particularly sophisticated tastes. You slide it free, surprised by how light it feels after the weight of the great ledger you've just returned. For a moment you expect this thinner book to be unimportant, a mere footnote to the grand tale. But when you open it, you see a collection of supplemental entries, corrections, and marginalia that feel more alive than anything you've read so far. The first folio begins with an apologetic heading, "Matters Not Yet Resolved." You almost laugh, because you suspect that in the centuries since, none of them ever were. You trace a line where a scribe has noted, in delicate script, that a certain manor claims 3 hides of land which the neighbouring reeve contests with energy. You expect a dry report, but the word energy catches you off guard. It sounds so human, like the weary sigh of a clerk forced to document a squabble he could never hope to settle. Further down, another note records that the meadow was measured again, yielding the same complaint. You imagine the surveyors pacing the same strip of sodden earth over and over, their boots caked with mud, their tempers fraying like old rope. You expect the Domesday Book to project certainty, but here you find the echo of stubborn disputes that no amount of ink could resolve. You pause, your fingertip resting against the faded words, and you picture the men arguing with gestures so practiced they might as well have been a local dance. You turn to the next folio, and this time you find a small diagram, a crude map sketched in uneven lines, showing the disputed boundary between 2 fields. You expect the map to bring clarity, but it looks more like the afterthought of a man who was trying to draw while holding back a sneeze. The river bends at an impossible angle. The fields are marked with tiny circles that might be trees or simply the scribe's impatience. You can almost hear him muttering that no one would ever look at this page again, never imagining that you would be here, centuries later, trying to decipher his exasperation. At the bottom of the folio, someone has written, "Here ends the account, though not the matter." You let your hand rest on that final sentence, struck by its quiet honesty. You expected finality, but what you found is a record of unfinished business pretending it was resolved. When you close the book, the parchment exhales a little cloud of stale air, smelling faintly of old grease and damp straw. You set it back in place and watch the shelf accept it with the same stoic resignation that seems to fill every corner of this room. You expected to feel a sense of completion as you stepped away, but instead you are left with the peculiar satisfaction of knowing that even the most meticulous records were still just people trying, and sometimes failing to measure the world into submission. You linger near the lectern, your hand still tingling from the contact with that thin, exasperated little volume, as if it left a residue of unfinished arguments on your skin. The light from the narrow windows slants across the shelves in bright strips, illuminating motes of dust that drift in the chill air like tiny, stubborn reminders that nothing ever truly settles. You glance back at the larger Domesday ledger, thinking that its imposing spine and brass clasps look no more certain now than they did when you first approached. You expect that returning to its pages will feel redundant, but there's a pull you can't ignore, a sense that you've missed something quietly important in all those cramped columns. You ease it open again and turn to a folio toward the end, where the script is smaller, more hurried, as though the clerks had decided the king's appetite for detail had finally outpaced their patience. You expect the same tidy rows of rents and obligations, but the first line you read is almost plaintive. No one here will say how many hides this land bears. You trace the letters with your fingertip, imagining the scribe pressing his quill against the parchment in frustration. Perhaps he hoped that by recording his exasperation, he'd be absolved of responsibility for the missing information. You expect the Domesday Book to be unassailable, but here it betrays the simple truth that some questions refuse to be pinned down. A few lines lower you find another note, this one written in a smaller, more cramped hand, measured twice, found to be less. You smile, because you suspect the scribe was too polite to add, much to everyone's dismay. You think of the landowners hovering behind him, lips pressed thin as he counted fewer acres than they'd boasted the year before. You expect the record to feel indifferent, but it is alive with the quiet resentment of people discovering their wealth had shrunk the moment it was measured. As you turn the page, you notice a smear of ink that trails across a sentence, an accidental flourish that feels almost human in its clumsiness. You run your thumb along the mark, wondering whether the scribe swore when he saw the blot, or simply sighed and kept writing. You expect perfection, but every folio here reminds you that accuracy was an aspiration rather than a guarantee. Farther down, you find a single word circled in red, vacant. It sits on the page like a small wound, a reminder that sometimes the absence of life was more significant than all the tallies of ploughs and oxen. You picture a settlement abandoned to weeds and silence, the villagers gone to some other place the clerks never reached. You expect these books to feel certain, but they are as full of absences as any memory. When you finally close the ledger again, it feels heavier than before, as if the weight of all those unsettled facts had seeped into your arms. You stand there a moment longer, understanding that this was never a book about property alone. It was a record of how a kingdom tried and failed to convince itself it could be measured to the last pig and the final blade of grass. You step back from the lectern and flex your fingers, surprised to find they've stiffened again just from holding the book open. It feels as though the Domesday Ledger has a talent for wearing out anyone who dares to linger too long, as if it considers curiosity a kind of impertinence. You walk slowly along the shelf, letting your fingertips skim over the cracked spines and tarnished clasps, and you think about how many hands have traced the same path, scribes, lords, curious strangers like yourself, all of them hoping this record might offer clarity that never quite materialized. You expect the shelf to feel inert, but it hums with a quiet defiance, as though the books are reminding you they don't owe you neat answers. You pause at a smaller ledger bound in faded red leather, the cover nearly smooth from centuries of palms pressing it flat. You lift it carefully and open to the first folio, where a column of entries records customary dues of the tenants. You expect dry obligations, bushels of barley, tokens of silver, but tucked between the expected demands is a line that makes you blink, a gift of honey, to be rendered in good faith. You imagine the beekeeper arriving with his offering, hands sticky, heart hopeful that the scribe would record it as promised. You expect bureaucratic coldness, but this line feels almost tender, a trace of something that survived even the weight of tax and tally. Turning the page, you find another record of dues this time, a note that a tenant owed one song, performed each Michaelmas. You nearly laugh because you hadn't expected to discover that even the king's record keepers sometimes had to note obligations that were measured in music instead of coin. You imagine a man standing in a cold hall, clearing his throat before launching into the same tune he had sung the year before, while the scribe jotted a line in the margin to prove it had been done. You expect the Domesday Book to be a monument to efficiency, but here you find a record so cluttered with small oddities that it feels almost mischievous. Your eye catches a marginal note in a cramped, spidery hand, The song this year was of poor quality. You trace the words with your fingertip and wonder whether the tenant ever knew that his performance had been immortalized as a disappointment. You expect solemnity, but each folio seems determined to prove that the ordinary world always finds a way to seep through the cracks. You close the ledger slowly, feeling the parchment settle with a sigh that sounds like the last word in a long argument. It strikes you that every page you've read has been filled with this same mixture of seriousness and absurdity, as if the clerks themselves were never sure whether they were recording history or simply collecting a catalogue of frustrations too persistent to ignore. You expect to feel the satisfaction of understanding, but instead, you are left with the sense that you've only brushed the surface of something much more complicated than anyone ever intended it to be. You set the volume back into its place and watch as the other books lean against it in silent solidarity. For all their contradictions and omissions, you think perhaps that is what these ledgers were always meant to be, a reminder that even in an age obsessed with measurement, there was always something left uncounted. You turn away from the ledgers and pace along the high shelves, your footsteps muffled by the thin layer of dust that seems determined to cling to everything, including the soles of your boots. You glance at the small windows set high in the wall, the light coming through in pale shafts that make the drifting particles sparkle like slow-motion snow. You expect the atmosphere to feel oppressive after so many hours spent among columns of figures, but instead you feel an unexpected lightness, as though you've finally accepted that these books will never explain themselves as tidily as you once hoped. You stop before one last volume, a supplementary survey compiled decades after the main Domesday Book, when a new generation of clerks decided that perhaps the kingdom still contained a few stray debts worth cataloguing. The cover is stained in irregular blotches that look suspiciously like the aftermath of a hasty meal. You lift the book and feel the boards flex under your hands, the leather soft with use, and the spine creased as though it has been forced open more times than it liked. You expect this later record to be more precise, the work of scribes who had learned from the first attempt, but as you ease open the folio, you are met by the same combination of neat ambition and quiet defeat. The first entries document a string of holdings in the north, each described in the same clipped tone, as if the clerk hoped that by reducing everything to uniform sentences, he could make it all feel more controllable. You expect that strategy to work, but every so often a phrase escapes that betrays the reality beneath the discipline. Feels not yet sown, owing to fear, reads one line, the word fear underlined in a thin, trembling stroke. You pause, feeling the sudden weight of that single admission, a crack in the veneer that lets you glimpse the human cost of all this counting. A few pages further, you find a passage noting that a manor was recorded by rumour only. You almost laugh, imagining the scribe scribbling down gossip, as though it carried the same authority as the king's seal. You expect certainty, but this record, too, is stitched together with half-heard claims and hesitant guesses, a quilt of second-hand information laid over a country that never held still long enough to be measured properly. You read on, and here and there, you find lines where the clerk has left a blank space, as if he simply ran out of energy to finish the account. You run your finger over one of these empty patches, feeling the small hollow in the parchment, where the nib might have hovered before giving up. You expect finality in these surveys, but each unfinished sentence feels like proof that no tale can ever be complete. When you close the book at last, it sags against your palms, a little lighter now that you know it was never as sure of itself as it pretended. You set it back among its fellows, feeling something close to fondness for its imperfections. You expected to leave this room with a clearer sense of the Domesday Book's authority, but instead you have collected a series of small admissions that together feel truer than any polished proclamation. They are proof that no matter how scientific a survey claims to be, it is always, in the end, just another attempt to wrestle order from the endless, shifting disorder of human life. You step away from the shelves of ledgers and feel the weight of all those calculations slowly slide off your shoulders. The air in this part of the scriptorium feels different, carrying a faint sweetness that reminds you of candle smoke mingling with something sharper, perhaps the crushed herbs the scribes used to keep insects from chewing their work into confetti. Here the books are smaller, their covers brighter, spines glinting with gold leaf that looks too delicate to have survived so many centuries. You expect these illuminated manuscripts to feel distant and ceremonial, But when you ease one onto the table, it opens with a kind of soft surrender, as though it has been waiting patiently for you to look closely enough to see its quiet mischief. The first page gleams in the slanting light, a riot of red, blue, and green so vivid you almost forget the cold. The border is a thicket of vines and tiny creatures, a fox curled around a stalk of ivy, a snail the size of your thumb wearing what appears to be a golden crown. You expect solemnity, but what you find is a page so alive with hidden jokes that you have to smile. You run your fingertip along the painted edge and feel the faint grit of the pigment, the brushstrokes so small they vanish if you blink. You turn the page carefully, and the next folio contains a miniature of a saint kneeling in prayer, surrounded by an audience of monks whose faces are rendered with loving detail, except that one of them, tucked into the corner, is sticking out his tongue. You expect reverence, but here it is again, the small, undeniable evidence that even the most pious hands couldn't resist slipping a little mischief between the lines. You wonder how many abbots scolded their scribes for such nonsense, and how many simply pretended not to see it, knowing that the work was better when it wasn't entirely earnest. Farther along, you find an elaborate capital letter, so tangled in ornament that you can hardly see the character it was meant to represent. Inside the looping branches, you discover a procession of rabbits carrying a banner emblazoned with a single word, Pax. Peace, the rabbits declare, as though they know full well no one will take them seriously. You expect the text to feel heavy with doctrine, but it is threaded through with small rebellions that make you wonder if the scribes took comfort in the idea that beauty was a kind of defiance. You close your eyes for a moment, imagining the hours spent hunched over these pages, the aching necks, the cramped hands, the soft exhalations when a line of paint went exactly where it should. You expect these books to have been created only out of duty, but now you suspect they were also acts of quiet pleasure, each illuminated initial a whispered admission that the work was worth doing for its own sake. When you open your eyes again, the colours seem to shimmer, a reminder that the centuries have not dulled them as much as you assumed. You expected to find a record of devotion, but you've also uncovered something gentler, a hidden agreement between scribe and reader that seriousness alone is never enough to sustain the spirit. You shift your weight, feeling the cold seep through the soles of your shoes as you lean closer to the manuscript, its pages so bright and intricate they seem almost out of place in this drafty stone room. The folio before you is alive with miniature scenes, monks working in gardens the size of your thumbnail, angels balancing on curling vines, a goat trying to climb a stylized tree that looks more like an elaborate candelabrum. You expect these decorations to be merely ornamental, polite flourishes around the real text, but the longer you look, the more you realize that the margins are where the true life of the manuscript hides. Your eyes wander to the edge of the page, where a small figure crouches behind an initial letter, peering out with an expression that is either mischief or worry you can't quite decide. You expect the figure to be a saint or a monk, someone appropriately reverent, but it's a layman in a short tunic, caught in the act of stuffing something under his cloak. You wonder if the scribe intended it as a warning or just a private joke tucked between the sacred lines. The colours are still so vibrant you feel you could almost smell the egg yolk that once bound the pigment to the page. You turn the folio gently, aware that the parchment remembers every careless hand it has ever met. The next page reveals a text about the virtues of patience, and yet the margin is crowded with animals engaged in activities that look anything but patient. A fox chasing a rooster, a cat curled up in a basket of grapes, as though determined to pretend it is invisible. You expect the illustrations to support the solemnity of the prose, but here again is that familiar reverence, a reminder that even the most earnest instructions can coexist with nonsense. You close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine the scribe bending over this very desk centuries ago, his breath clouding in the cold, his brush trembling with fatigue and stubborn satisfaction. Perhaps he told himself that the little fox and the smug cat didn't matter, that the text would outlast every jest. But you suspect he also knew that readers would love the fox more than any sentence about discipline and humility. You expect to feel respect for the scribe's diligence, but you also feel a peculiar kinship with their need to slip something subversive into the margins. You open your eyes and find yourself smiling. the cold forgotten as you study a final flourish tucked into the lower corner, a snail wearing a crown, perched atop a tiny castle, waving a banner that reads simply, "Note a bean." Take note, it commands, though you doubt even the sternest abbot could say exactly what you were meant to notice. You expect clear instruction, but this page offers something softer, an invitation to wander. When you close the manuscript, it folds itself into silence with the quiet dignity of a thing that knows it doesn't need to explain why it exists. You rest your hand on the cover for a moment longer, feeling the warmth you've borrowed from the painted scenes, and you realize that perhaps no book is ever only serious or only foolish, it is always both, stitched together in ways no ledger could ever quantify. You move your chair just enough to let a patch of pale light fall across the next manuscript, the gold leaf catching the glow so sharply it seems to burn in the gloom. You brace the cover with one hand, feeling the familiar hesitation of a book that has learned to resist being opened too easily. When you finally coax it flat, you expect to find a somber treatise on faith, lines of Latin marching in solemn procession down the vellum. And though the main text does deliver a sermon on obedience, the borders are alive with creatures so improbable you suspect the scribe had a private wager to see what he could get away with. The upper margin is crowded with birds wearing tiny blue hoods, each one peering intently into the text, as if hoping to catch the moral before it escapes. Along the side, a pair of rabbits stand on their hind legs, one gesturing emphatically at the other, as if arguing the finer points of theology. You expect these flourishes to feel trivial compared to the weight of the words, but the longer you study them, the more you feel that the scribes poured just as much devotion into these whimsical scenes as they did into any line of scripture. You run your fingertip along a narrow band of ornament where a procession of snails advances toward a castle whose gates are no higher than your thumbnail. One snail has been rendered in such exquisite detail that you can see the pattern of its shell, the glisten of its painted trail. You expect to feel removed, but instead you sense the scribe's quiet amusement, the private satisfaction of knowing that generations of readers would puzzle over why a manuscript about divine law required an army of mollusks. Turning the page, you discover a full-page miniature of the Last Judgment, vivid enough to make your breath catch. Angels trumpet from a sky the color of lapis, souls rise from coffins like startled guests, and a figure at the edge of the scene looks suspiciously like he's trying to slip out a side door unnoticed. You expect unbroken solemnity here, but even at the apocalypse, the scribe couldn't resist a sly wink. You think of how many abbots frowned over these pages, torn between disapproval and reluctant admiration for the audacity on display. At the bottom of the folio, a line of text sits alone, as though abandoned by the rest of the sermon. It reads simply, "He who observes closely will find more than he was meant to see." You pause, feeling the truth of that sentence settle over you like a soft cloak. You expected these books to be static relics, frozen in their piety, but instead they feel more like living puzzles, each page a reminder that understanding is never as complete as you imagine. When you ease the manuscript shut, the gold leaf glints one last time, an echo of the scribe's defiance that lingers in the dim air. You rest your palm on the cover, aware that you have not simply read a record of belief, but witnessed the quiet argument between solemnity and play, a debate that even centuries of reverence have not managed to resolve. You let your hand linger on the cover a moment longer before you draw another manuscript toward you, its leather so smooth it almost feels deceptive, as though it has been waiting centuries to surprise whoever dares to disturb its calm. When you lift the front board, the hinges creak softly, a small, dignified protest. You expect this one to follow the same patterned saints and parables hemmed in by exuberant borders, but the first folio you see is different. The text is sparse, each line spaced generously apart, as if the scribe had decided that every word deserved its own quiet margin. You find yourself slowing down, letting your eyes rest on each phrase, until you can almost hear the deliberate cadence of the writing. Here, the illumination is less playful but somehow more arresting. A single vine curls around the border, its leaves so delicately painted they seem alive. Tucked among them is a tiny figure of a monk bent over his own desk, brush poised in one hand, the other pressed to the small of his back in a gesture you recognize immediately. You expect the scribe to present himself as a model of serene devotion, but instead he has chosen to immortalize the ache of too many hours hunched over vellum. You smile, feeling the small shock of recognition pass between you and a man who died 1,000 years before you were born. You turn the page and discover that every folio carries another variation on this quiet self-portrait. Sometimes he appears in the corner, sometimes peeking out from behind an initial letter, each time engaged in the same labor. You expect these insertions to feel vain, but they don't. They feel like small admissions that all this patient ornament was made by someone who never forgot what it cost. You imagine him glancing up from his work, rolling his shoulders, then bending again to trace another line no one would ever think to praise. Further on, you pause over an image of a candle guttering in the darkness, a thin plume of smoke curling upward, where the flame has just died. The text beside it warns against spiritual complacency, but you suspect the scribe was also thinking of the moment his own candle burned out before he could finish a sentence. You expect the picture to be purely symbolic, but it feels stubbornly literal, a reminder that every illuminated manuscript is also the story of late nights and failing light. You close your eyes and try to imagine the hush of the scriptorium after sunset, the way shadows must have pooled in the corners while a few determined clerks kept working, their breath frosting in the cold. You expect to feel only admiration for their discipline, but what you feel instead is a kind of compassion, as though you've glimpsed the small, unspoken loneliness behind the gold leaf and the guaspo. When you finally close the manuscript, it yields without complaint, folding the scribe's tiny self-portraits back into the darkness. You rest your hand on the cover, grateful that somewhere inside all this reverence, there was still room for one man to admit he was tired. You set the manuscript back in its place with a careful push and feel a quiet reluctance, as if the book itself would rather remain open a little longer. You draw another volume forward, its cover darker than the rest, so worn around the edges that the leather looks like a piece of driftwood washed up from some earlier century. You expect the same sequence of Latin text and riotous ornament, but when you ease the pages apart, you find yourself face to face with a bestiarian encyclopedia of animals that blends observation, legend, and a kind of unembarrassed wonder. The first folio shows a lion standing in profile, its mane painted in radiant stripes of red and gold, as though the scribe had decided the king of beasts deserved to look like a festival banner. You expect a solemn description of virtues and vices, but the text opens with a declaration so delighted you nearly laugh. The lion is noble beyond any other creature, for he alone will not be roused by a mere noise. You picture the scribe nodding to himself, satisfied that he had captured the essential dignity of a creature he had never seen outside the borders of a page. Turning to the next folio, you find a unicorn rendered with improbable delicacy, its horns spiraling skyward like a wisp of spun sugar. You expect the accompanying passage to admit the creature's doubtful existence, but instead it insists with complete certainty that unicorns can be tamed only by virgins, and that they are often found sleeping in the laps of maidens under blooming trees. You wonder if the scribe ever paused to consider the likelihood of such scenes, or if he simply enjoyed the thought too much to question it. You expect these entries to feel naive, but their conviction is so complete it feels almost enviable. Further on, a dragon curls across the margin, its scales picked out in bright dots of copper pigment that still catch the light. The text beside it describes the creature's habit of collecting treasures and choking on its own greed, a moral folded into a myth. You expect the illustration to feel remote, but it looks almost playful, the dragon's expression less menacing than mildly inconvenienced by the burden of so many stolen crowns. You run your finger lightly along the edge of the painting and feel the smallest ridge where the pigment has thickened, a tactile proof that this story was made by a real hand. You pause over a folio near the end, where the scribe has added a final note in a smaller script. Here ends the Book of Beasts, though the beasts themselves do not end. You expect the closing to feel conclusive, but it reads more like an admission that no collection, however ambitious, could ever gather all the strangeness of the world into one binding. When you close the cover at last, it feels lighter than it did a moment ago, as if the book has given up a little of its mystery just by being held. You rest your palm on the worn leather, aware that somewhere between the solemn lions and ridiculous unicorns, you have found something that feels less like a catalogue and more like a quiet celebration of imagination itself. You run your hand along the shelf before reaching for the next manuscript, feeling the slight give in the old wood, as though the shelf itself is tired of carrying so many ambitions bound in leather. The volume you choose is smaller than the bestiary, but thicker, the boards warped just enough to make it sit awkwardly among its neighbours. You expect another solemn compilation psalms, perhaps, or the dense commentary of some long-dead theologian, but when you open it, you are greeted by a calendar, each month given its own page bordered by painted scenes of the year's labours. You pause over January, where a man huddles by a fire so small it looks more ceremonial than practical, his face hidden in the crook of his arm. You expect the image to be merely decorative, but the text beside it remarks dryly that the labours of winter are mostly to endure. You smile, surprised to find a note of resignation so plainly stated. It feels like the scribe was admitting what no official record ever liked to say, that survival itself was often the only task worth recording. Turning the folio, you find April, where a woman scatters seed into dark furrows. A dog waits behind her, tail curled as if about to spring. You expect this to feel distant, but you can almost hear the small rustle of the grain falling through her fingers. The cautious hope in that moment, when you trust something buried to rise again. The illustration is so precise you can make out the folds of her cloak, the way the painter has dabbed a single dot of white on the dog's nose to suggest a glint of life. You move through the months, and each scene seems to confess a small truth. August shows a reaper wiping sweat from his brow with a look that is closer to despair than triumph. November displays a pig being led to slaughter, its eyes wide with an intelligence you wish you hadn't noticed. You expect the calendar to be simply a record of tasks, but it feels more like a catalogue of endurance, a quiet acknowledgement that the cycle of the year is not always benign. In the margins of October, you discover a tiny figure, just a few strokes of brown ink of a man asleep beneath a tree, a loaf of bread clutched to his chest. There is no label, no explanation, but you can't help imagining that this was the scribe's little offering to any reader who needed permission to rest. You expect these pages to reinforce duty, but they also whisper that sometimes rest is the most honest labour of all. When you finally close the book, the painted seasons vanish under the boards, but the feeling remains, a quiet certainty that you have glimpsed something no ledger could measure, the small, unrecorded experiences that give the year its shape. You set the volume back on the shelf, and for a moment, it feels as if the scriptorium itself has exhaled, relieved to have shared one of its softer secrets. You ease your hand along the bindings, feeling their varied textures, smooth patches worn down by centuries of reverent hands, rough spots where the leather has cracked into tiny canyons of fatigue. The next manuscript you draw forward is heavier than you expect, its cover etched with a delicate lattice of vines that wind around a single word, speculum, a mirror. You expect the name to refer only to the text within a compilation of moral instruction, but the title feels like a quiet dare, inviting you to consider how much of yourself you'll find reflected in these pages. When you lift the cover, the parchment releases a dry, papery sigh that sounds almost amused. The first folio is a treatise on pride, each paragraph anchored by an illuminated capital, every letter alive with tiny scenes. In the crook of an S, a man hoists a golden cup over his head, only to be tripped by a small monkey tugging at his boot. You expect a stern sermon, but the scribe has left a margin note in a quick, slanting hand, thus do fools advertise their downfall. You imagine him smiling as he wrote it, satisfied with his miniature moral theatre. You turn the page and find a series of vignettes illustrating envy, each more absurd than the last. One shows a knight glaring at his neighbour's slightly taller cabbage, another depicts a woman peering over a fence to count someone else's hens. You expect the imagery to feel severe, but it's so gently mocking that you can't help but grin. You suspect the scribe knew exactly how petty people could be, and decided that ridicule was more instructive than fear. Further on, you pause at an illustration that feels almost too modern, a small figure hunched over a ledger, so intent on his calculations that he doesn't see his own cloak slipping into the candle's flame. The text beside it warns of the perils of greed, but you suspect the real lesson is that no ambition, however noble, is safe from ordinary carelessness. You expect moral instruction to feel remote, but this image feels uncomfortably close, like an unkind mirror held up to every reader who ever believed themselves immune to distraction. You lift your eyes from the page, feeling the hush around you deepen, as if even the walls are listening. The manuscript rests in your hands with the weight of something that has waited centuries to be understood, and half expects to keep waiting a little longer. You expect to feel chastened by its lessons, but what you feel instead is a curious tenderness for the scribes who filled these margins with sly humour, and for the readers who recognize themselves in the tiniest failures. When you close the cover at last, the gilded vines catch the light, winking in a final gesture of ironic blessing. You set the volume back on its shelf and stand for a moment with your palm pressed flat against the spine, grateful that for all their solemn purpose, these books were also allowed to be honest about the small humiliations that bind every generation together. You step back for a moment to stretch your spine, feeling the thin chill that seeps through the cracks in the scriptorium walls. The hush settles over you again, more companionable than oppressive, as though the books have decided to let you stay a little longer. You move to the last row of shelves, where the manuscripts are smaller and less ornate, their bindings plain but no less compelling. The volume you choose next is bound in a deep, almost black leather that absorbs the light instead of reflecting it. You expect it to be a register or a dry index, something purely functional, but as you lift the cover, you discover a miscellany pages stitched together from fragments that never quite fit anywhere else. The first folio is a collection of proverbs, each line separated by generous blank space. Some are familiar, better a slow friend than a swift enemy. Others are odd enough that you have to read them twice. He who counts the wind will never bake his bread. You expect the text to feel didactic, but instead it reads like a series of gentle reminders from someone who understood how often people forget the obvious. You trace one line with your fingertip and find yourself nodding, surprised by the quiet pleasure of encountering advice that still feels practical after so many centuries. You turn the page and find a single poem written in a careful, slanting hand. It begins with an invocation to the Virgin and ends with a description of a garden where the poet imagines meeting all the people he has lost. You expect the verse to be clumsy or overwrought, but it is plain and precise, every line balanced on the edge of grief and gratitude. You pause over a phrase describing the soft green of ordinary days, and you feel something ease in your chest, as though the book has offered you a permission you didn't know you needed. A few folios further, the scribe has inserted a letter, copied in full, from a woman asking for prayers for her husband's safe return from pilgrimage. You expect it to feel remote, but the writing is so immediate that you can almost hear her voice, the careful way she must have chosen each word. In the margin, someone has added a note in smaller script. He returned, but not unchanged. You rest your hand on the page, feeling the small ache that sentence leaves behind. You lift your eyes from the folio and imagine the scribe sorting through his scraps of vellum, deciding which words deserve to be rescued from obscurity. You expect him to have worked quickly, but you suspect he moved more slowly than he had to, savouring the chance to preserve something that mattered to someone, even if it would never be included in a grander record. When you close the manuscript, it feels softer in your hands than the others, as though all its disparate pieces have been stitched together with an unspoken understanding that not everything valuable is easily categorized. You set it carefully back on the shelf, aware that you've just read something more intimate than any illuminated gospel, a quiet archive of the things too small for history to notice, but too important for anyone to forget. You stand a moment longer, letting your hand rest on the closed cover, and you feel the warmth your touch has left behind, as though the manuscript itself is reluctant to return to its long, patient waiting. You scan the shelves for one final volume, choosing almost at random a book with the spine so faded you can barely read the title. You ease it free, feeling the boards shift under your fingers, and for a moment you expect it to be like all the others, a combination of text and decoration, earnest proclamations bracketed by little absurdities. But when you lift the cover, you discover a collection of glosses, commentary written in narrow columns beside a main text you can hardly see beneath the layers of ink. You expect the notes to be impersonal, but as you read, you realize they are more like letters to an unseen companion. One scribe has recorded doubts about the translation he is copying, another has added corrections, and a third has scribbled a marginal plea, "Forgive my errors, I was tired." You pause over that confession, feeling it settle into you with a weight gentler than regret. You expect the manuscript to project certainty, but every line of commentary reveals how tentative knowledge can be. You turn to the next folio and find a passage where the commentary nearly swallows the text, the glosses creeping over the margins in crooked lines. Between them, a small drawing emerges, a figure in a long robe with a hand pressed to his forehead, an image of a man exasperated by the words in front of him. You expect severity, but here is another quiet admission that even scholars have their limits. The figure looks so familiar in its weary posture that you feel an almost comical relief. Farther on, you find a gloss that reads simply, "This makes no sense to me," written in a script that slopes as though it was written in a hurry to be done. You almost laugh, imagining the scribe leaning back from his work and deciding that honesty mattered more than authority. You expect the commentary to feel distant, but it is so immediate you half expect to hear a voice muttering behind your shoulder. You close your eyes and try to picture the men who left these comments, each convinced that clarity might be possible if only they kept working. You expect to feel detached, but instead you feel a peculiar affection for them, these tired scribes who believed that every uncertain sentence was still worth saving. You open your eyes and read the final folio, where the last note is just 3 words, "Here we end." No preamble, no blessing, no apology, only the quiet surrender of someone who has accepted that no book can contain everything. When you close the manuscript, it feels as though it sighs in relief, the boards easing back into place with a softness that makes you think of a blanket being folded away for the season. You set it carefully on the shelf, aware that you have been reading not just a record of scholarship, but a testament to the unspoken permission to falter, to question, and to stop when there are no more words left to write. You draw a slow breath before reaching for the last manuscript in this row, feeling a peculiar reluctance to let the exploration end. The volume you select is neither the largest nor the most ornate, but there is something about its unassuming presence that feels like an invitation rather than an obligation. The binding is a dull brown, smoothed with age, and the leather has softened around the edges as if it has been handled so often that it learned to yield without complaint. You expect another collection of commentaries or proverbs, but when you lift the cover, you discover a book of hours prayers arranged by hours, each section illuminated with miniature scenes so detailed they seem to hover just above the parchment. The first folio opens to a painting of dawn. A figure stirs from sleep inside a narrow bed, the blanket folded back with exquisite care, while outside the window a sky blushing pink heralds a day that will be much like any other. You expect the image to feel idealized, but there is a gentleness to it that makes you think the artist wanted to honor the quiet miracle of waking up, not just the piety that would follow. You study the details, the small, rounded loaf of bread on the windowsill, the slippers placed precisely beneath the bedstead, and you feel an unexpected tenderness for this imagined life. Turning the page, you find a prayer for midday accompanied by an image of workers harvesting grain. They bend low, their hands lost in tall sheaves that shimmer with so many shades of gold it seems as though the artist had tried to trap the entire summer inside a border. You expect the scene to feel purely devotional, but it feels more like a recognition that prayer does not always begin in a chapel. Sometimes it starts in the field, with sweat stinging your eyes and the dull ache in your back reminding you that devotion can look suspiciously like ordinary labor. Further on, you pause over an image of a woman sitting by a hearth in the last hour of daylight. She holds a spindle in one hand and a scrap of blue cloth in the other. You expect her to be rendered in solemn stillness, but her expression is soft, almost amused, as though she has heard something just beyond the painter's ability to record. You think about all the evenings that must have ended this way, in the hush between work and sleep, when a single moment of laughter or memory can feel holier than any formal prayer. At the end of the book, you find a final miniature night. A small figure kneels by a narrow pallet, one hand resting on a closed book, the other raised in a gesture of weary gratitude. You expect this last image to insist on triumph, but it feels more like a quiet acceptance that every day ends, no matter how faithfully it was measured or how imperfectly it was lived. When you close the manuscript, you feel the hush gather around you again, not scolding but companionable, as though the scriptorium itself has been waiting to share this last reminder. You set the book gently back in its place and rest your hand on the worn leather, grateful for the way these pages have insisted, without apology, that devotion is not always the grand declaration you expect. Sometimes it is simply the record of another day, noticed with care. You stand in the center of the scriptorium for a moment, feeling the hush settle around your shoulders like a heavy cloak you forgot you were wearing. The air smells of dust and wax and the faint, sour note of old vellum that has spent too many centuries breathing in candle smoke. You expect to feel completely removed from the world that produced these manuscripts, but the longer you stand there, the more you sense the faint tug of familiarity, as though all this ink and parchment is trying to remind you that every generation believes it is the first to worry about losing its words to time. You think about the way knowledge travels now compressed into flickering screens, catalogued in digital ledgers that claim to hold everything but never feel quite as real as a page under your thumb. You expect that contrast to feel clean and satisfying, a straightforward evolution from the fragile to the permanent. But when you look back at the shelves, you find yourself wondering if permanence was ever really the point. The scribes did not expect their work to last forever. They expected it to last just long enough for someone else to care. You turn slowly in place, letting your eyes drift over the rows of books, each one stitched together with the same stubborn belief that something worth recording must be worth the inconvenience of record keeping. You expect to feel proud of modern convenience, but instead you feel a wary respect for the sheer commitment it took to copy a single sentence by hand. You try to imagine how it must have felt to spend weeks bent over a single folio, every letter a small wager that no ink blot would betray you before you finished. Your gaze settles on a shelf where several volumes lean together, their spines patched and mended with leather darker than the original bindings. You expect those repairs to look unsightly, a visible admission of failure, but instead they feel like quiet triumphs, proof someone believed these books were still worth saving even after time had gnawed at their edges. You rest your palm on one of the patched covers and feel the faint warmth left by all the other hands that paused here before yours. You let your mind drift to the present, to the idea of a digital archive so vast it can swallow 1,000 Domesday books without a shiver of strain. You expect that thought to feel reassuring, but it doesn't. It feels brittle somehow, as though the ease of storing knowledge has made it easier to forget that preservation was never only about keeping words safe. It was also about remembering who wrote them and why. You wonder how many of the scribes who laboured here ever imagined their work would be read by someone living centuries later, peering at their crabbed letters through the filter of electric light. When you step back from the shelf, you feel an odd gratitude that these books do not apologise for being imperfect. You expected them to feel inert, but instead they seem to radiate a quiet defiance, a refusal to vanish quietly into the category of obsolete. You stand a little straighter, aware that you have been reminded of something essential, that knowledge is not measured by its convenience but by the care someone was willing to spend in giving it form. You draw your fingertips slowly down the cracked leather spine, feeling each ridge and crease as though the book is reminding you how many other hands have lingered here, searching for something they could never quite name. You expect this last stretch of shelves to feel predictable after so many hours immersed in ink and parchment, but you find yourself more aware than ever of how little you can take for granted. The manuscript you lift next is smaller, bound in an unremarkable brown that looks almost humble compared to its gilt-embellished neighbours. You expect it to be a lesser volume, something incidental, but when you open it, the first page greets you with a phrase so gentle it feels like an apology. This book is for whoever has patience. You smile, startled by the honesty of that line. You expect these words to have been written with the same grand authority that fills the larger tomes, but here you sense something more personal, a quiet acknowledgement that reading, like writing, is an act of endurance as much as curiosity. You run your thumb along the edge of the page, feeling the raised lines where the ink has thickened over time, the slow accumulation of pigment that now sits like a faint relief map of someone's effort. You turn the folio, and the next page offers nothing but a list, the names of saints arranged without commentary, each line ending in the same small flourish that looks more like a sigh than a signature. You expect the repetition to feel dull, but instead it becomes almost hypnotic, as though the scribe was trying to make sense of his world by simply naming what he could not fully understand. You picture him bent over the desk, each name a small hope that something orderly might survive in a life too often interrupted by hunger, cold, or the abrupt demands of the bell calling him to prayer. Farther along, you find a short hymn copied in a hand so unsteady it looks as if the scribe was fighting sleep while he wrote it. The letters tip gently to the right, pressing against the edge of the margin like pilgrims eager to reach the end of their journey. You expect this page to feel disposable, but it radiates a kind of reluctant devotion, the kind that persists not because it is easy but because it is necessary. You rest your hand over the wavering lines, feeling the warmth of your own skin bleeding into the chill of the parchment. At the end of the volume, there is no colophon, no declaration of completion, only a final sentence in smaller script. It is enough. You let the words sink in, aware that they feel less like an ending and more like a weary benediction from someone who knew that no book could ever say everything. You expect to feel regret at the brevity of the manuscript, but instead you feel something closer to gratitude, as though the scribe has granted you permission to stop searching when you have found the one truth that matters to you. When you close the cover, it folds itself around the pages with a softness that feels almost conspiratorial, as if it too is content to leave some questions unanswered. You slide the book gently back into its narrow place, aware that in this quiet corner, where centuries of ambition and uncertainty have settled into something resembling peace, you have discovered the simplest and most difficult lesson of all, to be satisfied with enough. You draw another breath and move along the shelf, the hush of the scriptorium settling over your shoulders like a curtain pulled slowly shut. You rest your palm on the next book's spine before you lift it, feeling the indentation left by countless other hands that stopped here, if only for a moment, to wonder whether the words inside would offer any new certainties. You expect this final manuscript to be much like the others, a combination of devotion, duty, and the occasional hidden joke, but when you open the cover, the first folio is startling in its plainness. There are no illuminations here, no colours bright enough to stain your gaze. Just lines of text in a hand so tidy it looks almost machine-made, each letter settled into its place without a tremor. You lean closer, reading the opening sentence. This record is prepared in the hope that it will not be required. You pause, startled by the bluntness, and you realize this is no theological treatise or list of saints. This is a register of famines. You expect the entries to feel impersonal, but the dates and details accumulate like small bruises across the page, each line a quiet record of the year, when the grain failed, or the river rose too high, or the price of bread outpaced the ability to pay for it. You turn to the next folio, and the headings continue in unbroken sequence. The winter of hunger, the year of small harvest, the months of spoiled grain. Each account is only a paragraph long, but it doesn't feel abbreviated. It feels exhausted, as if the scribe could do nothing more than write the bare facts and hope that naming them would be enough. You expect to feel distance from these old calamities, but you find yourself imagining the hush in each household when the last loaf was divided, the dull relief when it was gone and there was gone, and there's nothing left to decide. Further on, you find a note added in a smaller hand, a late entry that doesn't even bother with a title. It reads, "In this year there was nothing worth recording," a sentence so resigned it feels like a door closing. You expect that line to depress you, but it doesn't. It feels honest in a way you hadn't expected, a confession that sometimes survival is too quiet to leave much evidence behind. You rest your hand on the page for a moment, as if you might warm the ink back into life. When you lift your eyes, you notice that someone, another reader, maybe centuries before you, has underlined a single sentence. The stores were counted, but no one believed they would last. You expect that emphasis to feel hopeless, but instead it feels like solidarity, as though you and that long-vanished reader are briefly sharing the same recognition that fear and endurance are never as separate as you'd prefer. You close the manuscript gently, letting the covers meet with a soft click that sounds almost relieved. You place it back on the shelf and step back, aware that this plain, unadorned record has undone you more completely than all the bright illuminations you studied before. You expected to find solemn history here, but you have found something simpler, the unpretentious courage of ordinary people who kept measuring the grain, even when they knew it was running out. You stand in the narrow aisle a little longer, feeling the odd comfort of knowing that every volume here was created by hands just as uncertain as yours. When you reach for the next manuscript, you do so slowly, as though the act of touching it might somehow disturb the hush that has grown so thick you can almost taste it. The cover is smoother than you expect, the leather worn down to a softness that feels almost like cloth. You open it expecting another ledger of shortages or another record of pious intentions, but the first folio greets you with an entirely different ambition, a catalogue of inventions, written in the measured Latin of a mind, determined to prove that curiosity could be as worthy of preservation as faith. You trace the heading with your fingertip, De Instrumentis et Novitatibus, of devices and new things. You smile, because you hadn't thought to find a medieval encyclopedia of oddities here among the more solemn works. You expect the entries to be whimsical, and some are a design for a water clock shaped like a lion, a sketch of a windmill that could supposedly grind flour in half the usual time. But others are described with such hopeful precision you feel a small ache behind your ribs. One section details a system of pulleys meant to lift heavy loads with a single hand, an idea so ambitious it seems designed to fail. Yet the scribe records every measurement and material, as though he believed that if he wrote it carefully enough, the world itself would have to cooperate. You turn the page and find a drawing of a loom, accompanied by instructions so thorough you suspect the scribe must have built one himself. You expect the text to feel dated, but the earnestness is timeless, a reminder that even in centuries you think of as stagnant, there were always people imagining how life might be made more bearable, more efficient, maybe even more beautiful. You pause over a passage describing a device by which one man may raise water from a deep well without exhaustion, and you think about the tired shoulders and blistered palms that must have inspired it. Further on, you find a marginal note in a different hand, smaller and more doubtful. This may not work. You almost laugh, because you can hear the quiet argument echoing across time, the scribe who believed and the scribe who preferred caution. You expect that contradiction to feel frustrating, but it feels honest instead, a small testament to the reality that no idea ever arrives without skepticism trailing close behind. When you close the book, it yields with a sigh so soft it feels like a scent. You rest your palm on the smooth leather and wonder how many of the inventions within ever left the page. You expect to feel disappointment, but what you feel instead is respect for the simple audacity of recording dreams alongside more practical concerns. You set the manuscript carefully back in its place, feeling the hush gather around you again, and you realize that while the modern mind likes to imagine it invented curiosity, the evidence here suggests otherwise. You step back slowly, aware that the shelves have given you more than you expected, not only the record of what was, but the reminder that even in the quietest corners of history, someone was always trying to imagine something better. You pause with your hand resting lightly on the shelf, aware of the hush breathing against your skin, the way old air seems to settle in your lungs until you can almost taste the centuries. The next volume you choose is tucked between two larger books, its spine so narrow it seems to vanish when you glance away. You expect it to be a minor work, perhaps a single sermon or a ledger of tithes, but when you ease it out, you feel the peculiar weight that only comes from a book that has been handled too often to remain indifferent. You lift the cover and find a collection of letters, correspondence between scribes in different monasteries, each trying to understand how their work fit into a world they could not see in full. The first folio opens with a greeting so formal it feels almost ceremonial, to the brother whose name I do not know, but whose questions I have received. You expect the letter to be dry, a polite refusal to share any useful knowledge, but as you read, you hear the faint warmth beneath the formulaic phrases. The scribe confesses that he too has struggled to keep his lines straight in damp weather, that he too has cursed the way vellum will curl no matter how carefully it is weighted. You find yourself smiling, surprised by how familiar the complaints sound, as if centuries have done nothing to soften the frustrations of ink and time. Turning the page, you discover another letter, this one written in a smaller, more delicate script. It begins with a question. How did you learn to trust that your work was worth the hours it consumed? You pause, feeling the quiet gravity of the question, the way it seems to drift across centuries to settle somewhere behind your ribs. You expect the reply to be evasive, but it is painfully direct. I have never been certain, except that it felt worse to stop. You let that sentence linger in your mind as you trace the fine strokes of the letters, each one steady despite the doubt it contains. Further on, you find a scrap of parchment sewn into the binding, a note so brief it reads more like a sigh than a statement. If you are tired, rest. You expect the words to feel insufficient, but instead they feel like an unexpected kindness, a reminder that no amount of devotion can replace the simple necessity of stopping. You close your eyes for a moment, imagining the scribe who wrote it, bent over a dim desk with a candle sputtering toward its end, deciding that this was the one truth he felt qualified to record. When you open your eyes again, you notice the edges of the pages are uneven, cut by different hands at different times, as if the letters were gathered slowly, never meant to become a single volume. You expect that to make the book feel fragmented, but it feels whole in a way you hadn't anticipated, stitched together by the same question echoing from page to page. How do you measure the worth of something you can never finish? When you close the cover, it folds softly, the binding so pliant it feels almost grateful to be held. You set it gently back in its place, and as your hand falls away, you feel the hush gather close again, a quiet agreement that sometimes the most important knowledge is the kind that has no answer at all. You shift your weight carefully, feeling the floor creak in a way that seems almost approving, as if the room itself is pleased you haven't hurried your departure. You let your hand drift along the spines of the remaining books, aware that you are trying to prolong this moment before the modern world reclaims you with its humming screens and bright, insistent notifications. When you finally draw the next volume free, you're struck by how unassuming it is. No gilt decoration, no ornate clasps, just a cover so dark it almost disappears against the shadows. You expect the contents to be equally plain, but the first folio surprises you with a heading that seems almost defiant. On the uselessness of anxiety. You blink, unsure if you have read it correctly. And when you look again, the words remain, patient in their conviction. You expect a philosophical treatise full of complicated sentences and abstract concepts, but what follows is a series of brief reflections, each no longer than a paragraph. The first begins with a sentence so simple it feels as if the scribe meant to whisper it rather than write it. Anxiety is the habit of believing everything depends on you. You let your gaze soften over the ink, which has faded to a brown so pale it seems more like memory than record, and you feel an unexpected ache behind your ribs. You turn the page slowly, half afraid the next section will spoil the calm the first has left behind. Instead, you find a meditation on the way worry multiplies itself, each thought sprouting new concerns like weeds in a neglected garden. The scribe describes how he once tried to keep a ledger of every fear that visited him in the night, only to discover that the list never ended, and that he could not remember which anxieties were real and which were only the echo of old dread. You expect that confession to feel foreign, but it feels familiar in a way you wish it didn't. Further on, you pause over a paragraph that begins, "To be free of fear is not to be ignorant of danger, but to be unwilling to be ruled by it." The letters are larger here, as if the scribe wanted no reader to miss the line, and you imagine him leaning back from the desk, wiping a cramped hand against his robe, and wondering if anyone would ever bother to read these words. You expect this assertion to sound naive, but it feels sturdy instead, as though it has been tested against more nights than you could count. At the end of the manuscript, there is no formal closing, no flourish of a final blessing, only a single line written in a script so small you have to lean in to read it. This is not everything, but it is what I have learned. You close your eyes, letting that quiet declaration settle into you, the way a stone settles in water, not with a splash but with a gradual, steady descent. When you close the cover, you find your hands lingering against the worn leather, reluctant to let go of the unassuming grace it has offered. You expect to feel foolish for being moved by so little, but instead you feel steadier, as though someone you will never meet has reached across the centuries to assure you that no mind ever found peace by cataloguing every possible disaster. You return the book to its place, aware that its lessons are harder to keep than they are to admire. You stand in the narrow corridor between the shelves, feeling the hush deepen until it seems to press lightly against your ears. like the moment just before someone speaks a truth you didn't expect to hear. You rest your hand on the next volume without opening it yet, taking a moment to trace the faint grooves where a title once shone in gilt that has long since worn away. You expect this manuscript to be more of the same, a litany of obligations or a tidy collection of prayers, but as you lift the cover, you feel the subtle shift in your breath that always comes when something quietly disarms you. The first folio contains nothing but lists plain inventories of tools, garments, small household possessions. You almost smile, because after all the elaborate illuminations, there is something endearing in this unadorned practicality. You expect the entries to feel dull, but each line is so specific you begin to picture the lives behind the words. 1 kettle, dented, 3 blankets, thin, a pair of shoes, too small but kept. You pause over that last phrase, surprised by how much you recognize the impulse to hold onto something inadequate simply because it is yours. You turn the page and find the same tidy hand recording more of the ordinary. 1 comb, missing teeth, a sack of flour, part spoiled, a jug, cracked but serviceable. You expect to feel distance from this meticulous accounting, but instead you feel a peculiar intimacy, as though you have stumbled into someone's private admission that survival is built from compromise more often than triumph. You imagine the scribe, candle guttering on the desk, deciding that even these flawed possessions deserve to be remembered. Further along, you discover a small slip of parchment sewn into the margin, a note written in a different hand. These are not treasures, but they are all we have. You close your eyes for a moment, feeling that sentence settle somewhere deep and quiet inside you. You expect it to feel melancholy, but it doesn't. It feels honest in a way that leaves no room for regret. You lift your gaze and think about how easily the modern mind confuses abundance with security. How often you expect to feel whole simply because you have more than your ancestors could have imagined. You expect this contrast to make you proud of progress, but instead it humbles you, because there is a clarity in these sparse records that no abundance can erase, that enough is sometimes only the smallest sum of what you manage to keep. When you close the manuscript, the boards come together with a soft, exhausted sigh, as though the book itself is relieved to be set down. You hold it a moment longer, feeling the smoothness of its edges worn by countless careful hands, and you realize that these lists, so humble on their face, are a testament to something unglamorous but necessary, the courage it takes to keep counting when nothing seems worth counting anymore. You set the volume gently back on the shelf, feeling the hush close in around you again, and you think perhaps this is the most persistent lesson these books have left behind, that no matter how modern you become, you will always be searching for a way to name what matters. You draw your hand back and rest it against your chest for a moment, feeling the faint thrum of your own heartbeat, a quiet counterpoint to the hush that has reclaimed every corner of the scriptorium. You know you should leave soon, that the modern world is already waiting to reclaim your attention with its glow and noise, but you find yourself reaching for another manuscript, as if you have been given permission to linger a little linger. The spine is thick and deeply ridged with wear, the leather so dark it absorbs the light instead of reflecting it. You expect to find another record of practical matters, but when you ease it open, the first folio greets you with a heading so plain it takes a moment to register, Thoughts Without Title. You blink, surprised by the understatement, and when you look again, the words remain modest, unassuming, patient. You expect a compilation of unfinished fragments, and in a way that is exactly what it is, sentences that drift across the page without any clear intention to become more. It is better to sit in silence than to pretend to understand. One begins, the ink so faded you have to squint to make out each letter. Another simply reads, a life can be measured by how often it was interrupted. You expect the vagueness to frustrate you, but instead it feels like an invitation to admit your own uncertainties. Turning the page, you find that the scribe has left long spaces between each line, as if he wanted to be sure no one would mistake these reflections for authoritative conclusions. One sentence stands alone in the middle of an otherwise blank folio. There is no shame in stopping. You read it twice before you realize you've been holding your breath. You expect the sentiment to feel obvious, but in the quiet of this room, it feels radical. Further on, you find a small drawing tucked into the margin, a figure sitting cross-legged, hands resting loosely on bent knees, gaze turned not toward the text but outward. as if watching something you can't see. There is no label, no explanation, only the soft outline of a person untroubled by the need to prove anything. You expect to feel puzzled, but you feel instead a sense of permission, as though the scribe left this image here so you would remember that observation can be an end in itself. At the end of the manuscript, you find no closing statement, no flourish of concluding authority, only a final line written in smaller, steadier script. I did not finish this, because I did not know where to end. You close your eyes, feeling the truth of that admission settle into you like a hand resting lightly on your shoulder. You expect to feel impatience with the incompleteness, but you feel gratitude instead, because it frees you to wonder without requiring you to decide. When you close the cover, it folds around the pages with a softness that seems to whisper that nothing important is ever truly finished. You return the book to its place, aware that in this quiet, uneven record, you have encountered the most modern sentiment of all, the quiet insistence that sometimes not knowing is its own kind of knowledge. You stand in the narrowing corridor of shelves, feeling the hush settle in your chest in a way that no amount of bright electric screens ever manages to do. You run your hand along the last volumes in this row, and you realize you are searching for something you can't quite define, perhaps the reassurance that your questions have been asked before, or that your doubts are less original than you sometimes imagine. When you finally choose a manuscript, it is a thin book whose spine has almost collapsed under the slow crush of heavier neighbors. You expect the cover to resist your touch, but it opens willingly, as though it has been waiting for an excuse to show you what it holds. The first folio contains a record of confessions, but not the kind you expect. Instead of lists of sins and penances, the scribe has recorded statements of uncertainty, each one beginning with the same phrase, "I do not know." You feel your breath catch in your throat as you read them, each line so plain it feels almost daring. "I do not know whether my work pleases God. I do not know if my hunger is caused by my failings. I do not know what becomes of the words no one reads." You expect to feel discomfort at this vulnerability, but instead you feel a quiet solidarity, as though the scribe has offered you permission to admit your own hesitations without shame. You turn the page and find a smaller script continuing the litany. "I do not know how to keep my mind from wandering. I do not know if the end is near." You rest your thumb along the margin, feeling the faint indentations where another hand once pressed down too hard in the act of writing. You expect the repetition to grow tedious, but it becomes almost soothing, each admission stacking neatly atop the last until it feels like a kind of prayer you never learned to say. Further on, you pause over an entry that reads, "I do not know if I have written anything worth keeping." The line is so familiar you nearly close the book in self-defense, but instead you let your eyes linger on it until you feel the ache it carries soften into something closer to understanding. You expect to feel exposed, but the scribe's plain honesty feels like a hand extended across the centuries, offering not certainty but companionship. Near the final folio, you discover a sentence squeezed into the space beneath another entry. "I do not know how to end this." You smile, feeling something in you unclench, because it is the same confession you have carried into every unfinished thought and every half-finished ambition. You expect that admission to feel like failure, but here, in the hush of this narrow aisle, it feels like the most truthful conclusion anyone could have written. When you close the manuscript, the covers meet with a soft hush that sounds more like forgiveness than finality. You set it carefully back on the shelf, aware that you will remember these unadorned sentences longer than any elaborate illumination. You expected to feel burdened by the scribe's uncertainty, but you walk away with the quiet conviction that not knowing is sometimes the only honest place to begin. You draw one last breath of the cold, book-scented air and feel a peculiar reluctance to let go of this quiet place where uncertainty isn't a flaw but a form of honesty. Your hand moves almost by instinct to the final volume on the shelf, its cover so worn the leather has become as soft as old fabric. You expect it to be another ledger or a devotional text, but when you ease it into your palms you discover a manuscript that feels different before you even open it, lighter somehow, as though it carries less burden than the others. When you lift the front board, the first folio greets you with an unadorned heading on the small uses of time. You expect a list of admonitions, the sort that reduce every hour to an obligation, but the first paragraph surprises you with its gentleness. If you find yourself idle, do not rush to fill the moment. Idleness is not always an enemy. You pause, letting the sentence settle in the space between your ribs, and you feel something uncoil in your chest that you hadn't realized was clenched. You read on, finding that each short section offers a different reflection, some about prayer, others about rest, a few about the small consolations that appear when you stop demanding usefulness from every minute. You turn the page slowly, half afraid the text will shift into reprimand, but it doesn't. Instead, you find a passage that begins, "There is no virtue in being constantly occupied," a sentiment so at odds with the modern cult of productivity that you have to read it twice to be sure you haven't misunderstood. The scribe continues in a hand that grows steadier with each line, describing how even the most devout monk sometimes needed to let the mind wander, to watch the play of candlelight on stone or the slow drift of dust motes through the evening air. You expect to feel skepticism, but instead you feel relief, as though you have been granted permission to be human in a way no timetable ever allows. Further on, you pause over a sentence that feels as intimate as a whisper. When you cannot continue, it is no failure to stop. You close your eyes for a moment, feeling the truth of that line settle against the quiet ache that always follows too many days spent measuring your worth by your output. You expect the sentiment to feel indulgent, but it doesn't. It feels precise, like a small blade cutting clean through the knots you didn't know you'd tied around your own expectations. At the end of the manuscript, there is no flourish of closing rhetoric, only a single line, written in smaller script. Perhaps it is enough to be here. You read it twice, then 3 times, because it feels like the simplest and most impossible idea you have ever encountered. You expect to feel impatient with such modesty, but instead you feel a quiet wonder, as though the scribe's soft assertion has offered you a shelter you didn't know you needed. When you close the book, it folds shut without a sound, and you stand there a moment longer, hand resting on the smooth, warm leather. You return the volume to its place and step back into the aisle, aware that in this room of fragile paper and tired ink, you have been reminded of something older than any text, that sometimes the greatest act of devotion is simply allowing yourself to pause. You stand in the doorway of the scriptorium, feeling the cool air press against your cheek, like a quiet reminder that time here has moved differently. The shelves behind you recede into shadow, their spines leaning together in the familiar, conspiratorial way of old books that have outlasted every ambition that once filled their pages. You think of all the hands that held these volumes, monks and scribes, scholars and wanderers, the curious and the tired, and you feel something softer than nostalgia settle over you, something closer to gratitude. You don't expect to leave feeling lighter, but you do, as though each confession and unfinished sentence has gently unfastened the knots you carried into this place without even noticing. You glance back once more, letting your gaze rest on the unremarkable covers, the faded titles, the small repairs that tell you someone once believed these books were still worth saving. You remember the quiet sentences tucked between proclamations, the doodles hidden in the margins, the plain admissions of uncertainty that felt more honest than any polished declaration. It occurs to you that in the end, the power of these manuscripts isn't only in what they record, but in what they quietly allow, the permission to remain unfinished, to wonder without always deciding, to pause without apology. You draw a slow breath, feeling the hush of the scriptorium wrap itself around you one last time. It does not scold or urge you to hurry. It simply waits, companionable and undemanding, as if it knows you will carry something of this place with you whether you mean to or not. You rest your palm on the doorframe, feeling the rough grain of the wood beneath your hand, and you think perhaps that is the final lesson. No matter how the world changes, no matter how bright or fast it becomes, there will always be corners where the pace softens and the questions are allowed to linger without fear of judgment. And tonight, you are the one who must carry the basket once more,